On November 29, 1781, the crew of a ship off course in the Caribbean held a desperate meeting. Below their feet were hundreds of people crammed into narrow spaces no human being should have ever had to suffer. As bad as that was, though, when the meeting was concluded, what happened to them next was far more disturbing. What the crew decided and what they proceeded to do was so horrific that it would go on to cause sweeping changes on an entire industry. This is their horrifying story, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. By the end of November 1781, a ship known as the Zong was already in bad shape. It had been at sea for months, pushing its way across the Atlantic with far more people on board than it had any business carrying. Strangely, anyone looking at it from the outside would have seen an ordinary merchant vessel. Inside, though, nothing was running the way it should have been. The man officially in charge, Captain Luke Collingwood, was barely conscious from illness. He was actually so sick that the crew could no longer count on him for decisions, leaving the ship drifting from one substitute leader to another. More importantly, though, hundreds of captives were crammed into spaces below deck that were never meant to hold so many human beings. Disease had already taken hold, and the heat and lack of ventilation only made things worse. People were getting sick faster than the crew could manage, and the strain of so many sick captives added to the panic that was building on board. This would have been a problem for any ship, but to make things worse, the crew of the Zong wasn't exactly a stable unit. Their first mate, James Kelsall, had been removed from duty after an argument with the captain weeks before. Another man, Robert Stubbs, a former captive ship captain who was only traveling on the Zong as a passenger, had stepped in here and there to direct things, but because he wasn't officially part of the crew, he had no authority to lean on. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the Zong came within sight of its destination of Jamaica without realizing it, but the crew misidentified the island entirely and continued sailing past it, extending the voyage by hundreds of miles. That one mistake pushed the ship into an even deeper crisis as supplies were running low and temperatures were running short. Soon enough, no one was confident about how long the remaining drinking water would last, and rumors spread among the crew that they might not have enough to make it to port. Without strong leadership, those rumors grew to great concern. Tensions grew stronger on the ship, and men gathered to discuss what they believed was a worsening situation. They wondered what they could do if the water ran out and how they could prevent a total disaster. Understanding how something as horrific as what was about to happen on the Zong begins with looking at the world at the time. By the late 1600s and into the 1700s, European trade was exploding. Ships were moving between continents constantly, carrying goods, raw materials, and in the case of the Atlantic slave trade, millions of people forced into servitude. With so much movement came the usual risks of storms, shipwrecks, piracy, and disease, and that risk created a financial opportunity that London took advantage of. Maritime insurance grew into a major industry during this time period as merchants needed a way to protect themselves when a ship didn't make it back or when cargo was lost along the way. One company, Lloyd's, which started as a coffeehouse where traders gathered, found itself in the center of this new insurance market, and by the 18th century, insurance became one of the driving forces of the London economy. The captive trade fit right into the system, as captives were legally treated as cargo, so they were insured like any other product being shipped across the ocean. Each person had a monetary value assigned, and if someone died in a way that was recognized as a covered loss, the ship's owners could be compensated. That meant insurers routinely made money from voyages that carried captive human beings, and merchants used insurance to minimize their risk and maximize their profits. And this ran deep too, as the people who backed the ships, supplied the credit, and funded voyages benefited enormously. Historians now estimate that a substantial portion of the money moving through the insurance market at the time was connected to this brutal trade. As horrific as this is in retrospect, quickly this became normalized as just a part of British economic life. As long as captives were viewed legally as property, ships, merchants, insurers, and bankers could treat lives like dollar signs. By the time the Zong set sail for Jamaica in 1781, that system was fully mature. Financial incentives and laws were all in place, and no one in power had challenged the idea that killing people who were viewed as cargo could be considered a business decision instead of a crime. Long before the Zong was known under that name, though, it was an ordinary Dutch vessel called the Zorg. By the late 1770s, it was being used in the Dutch captive trade, carrying captives to colonies in South America. This then changed abruptly in 1781 during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. British ships captured the Zorg off the coast of West Africa and brought it to a nearby port. A seized ship was a valuable asset, so in early March, a group of Liverpool businessmen bought the vessel, and each of the men who purchased a stake in the ship did business in the captive economy. Renaming a captured ship was also routine, so the Zorg became the Zong under its new owners. This was also a notable transaction because 244 captives were already on board when it was seized by the British, so they were actually counted as part of the payment. Once the Liverpool merchants secured the ship, they prepared it to enter the Atlantic trade under their management with the goal of turning it into a profit-generating vessel as fast as possible. Just as quickly, a crew was formed, but things started out with a questionable decision. Luke was not a seasoned captain, and his background was in medicine, not seafaring. He had spent years as a surgeon on captive ships, which meant he understood the trade from the perspective of someone who examined captives. His job as a surgeon was to judge each potential captive's physical condition and help determine who was likely to survive the crossing and get a good price. This was a role that put him in situations where he would have witnessed and sometimes participated in decisions about who lived and who didn't. This obviously didn't qualify him to run a ship, but it did provide the Liverpool merchants with a keen eye they hoped could help further their profits. James, the first mate, was also similarly unqualified. He was more familiar with Luke than with command himself. He served alongside him before, and like most officers on a captive ship, he understood the violent reality of the trade, but he too had never led a voyage. Robert, meanwhile, the Zong's only passenger for the first voyage under Liverpool management, had far more experience than either Luke or James in captaining, but he was simply hitching a ride back to Britain. Then the rest of the officers and crew were made up of whoever could be hired on short notice. Captive ships were dangerous workplaces, and sailors in Britain knew it. Disease and uprisings in particular made these voyages the kind of jobs men avoided unless they were desperate. So since the Zong had been a captured Dutch ship, some of the members of the old Dutch crew remained on board. Others came from the William, a ship owned by the same Liverpool group, and the rest were picked up along the African coast where unemployed or semi-experienced sailors could often be recruited cheaply. In total, the Zong was set to sail with 17 crew members, far too few for what lay ahead. Managing hundreds of captives required manpower to maintain order, move supplies, clean the decks, and respond to emergencies. This created some of the initial tensions that brewed on board, and the problems would grow before the first voyage even departed. British captive ships of the era packed people into tight quarters, but the Zong went far beyond even those brutal standards. By the time it was ready to leave Africa in 1781, the ship was carrying 442 captives, more than double what a vessel of its size could reasonably handle. There were informal guidelines based on tonnage that helped determine how many people a ship could transport without causing catastrophic overcrowding. On average, ships built for the trade carried around 1.75 captives per ton. The Zong, meanwhile, was loaded at a rate more than twice that. That meant every space below deck was crammed with bodies. Men, women, and children were confined shoulder to shoulder and locked in for most of the day. Disturbingly, the obscene level of overcrowding on the Zong wasn't by accident. The more people the merchants could get onto a ship, the higher the potential payout once they reached the Caribbean. Every additional captive was another sale, but this kind of loading made the voyage dangerous from the start. Disease spreads faster in crowded spaces, and sanitation is impossible to maintain. Even routine tasks like distributing food or moving the sick took more time and effort than the undermanned crew could supply. And speaking of supplies, the overcrowding increased the pressure on the necessities on board. A ship loaded with twice the number of captives required more food and drinking water than usual, but the Zong did not adjust its figures to match the number of people it carried. This left the ship vulnerable to shortages long before it crossed the Atlantic. Despite all of this, though, on August 18, 1871, the Zong left Accra, Ghana, on the West African coast and began making its way to Jamaica. Before heading west, the ship stopped in Sao Tome to take on fresh drinking water. Usually, the first mate would oversee the loading of food and water, checking quantities and making sure the water casks were still doing their job. On the Zong, though, this apparently didn't happen. James simply didn't supervise the process. Whether that was due to negligence, disorganization, or the chaotic nature of the crew, no one knows for sure. Making matters worse, the cooper, who was a crew member responsible for building and repairing water barrels, was sick and unable to work. That meant that no one checked whether the water casks were sealed properly. If the casks leaked, there was no easy way to replace them on the open ocean. So by the time the Zong pushed back out to sea, the crew had no idea whether their supplies were secure and plentiful enough. Meanwhile, conditions below deck deteriorated quickly. With so many people packed into inhumanely tight spaces, illness spread at a pace the crew couldn't keep up with. And sickness affected everyone from the captives to the actual captain. When the Zong reached the vicinity of Tobago, this was the crew's chance to replenish water and supplies again before making the final stretch toward Jamaica. For reasons never fully explained though, the ship sailed past the island without stopping. Luke by this point was among the sick and too ill to function, and 6 days earlier James had been removed from duty after a heated argument with Luke. The ship was effectively without a leader, and it seems with everyone's attention on who was actually leading the ship, the Zong missed a critical opportunity to resupply. Another blow came shortly after, as it was discovered that some of the water casks actually had leaked. How much water had been lost was unclear, but it was believed they still had enough to reach Jamaica safely. Despite this belief though, rumors and doubts started to spread around the ship that water was running low, and this sparked a wave of fear that only further blinded the already disorganized crew. In the final days of November, the Zong came close enough to Jamaica that the crew could actually see land on the horizon. However, they made a fatal mistake. The crew believed they were looking at the French-controlled territory of Saint-Domingue instead. With Luke incapacitated and the command structure basically in shambles, the Zong continued sailing west, leaving Jamaica behind without realizing what had happened. It took roughly 2 days for the crew to recognize the error, and by then, the Zong was already hundreds of miles off course. And by the time they corrected their course, the crew was already dealing with a heavy toll from the voyage. Several sailors had died and dozens of captives had succumbed to disease, around 62 people in total. So on November 29th, the officers gathered to talk about what they believed was a looming shortage. Of course, because the supplies hadn't been supervised, no one even knew if this shortage was real or imagined, but that didn't really matter in the moment. They knew they had lost some water from the damaged casks, and they knew the voyage had been extended because of a navigational error. The combination seems to have convinced them that they might not have enough water to keep everyone alive until they reach port. But even still, from any reasonable moral standpoint, the next part of the story is almost impossible to comprehend. The captives on board, again, were insured as cargo. If they died of disease, dehydration, or starvation, the ship owners would receive nothing through the insurance. But if they were thrown overboard in a situation the crew could claim was necessary to protect the ship, then the insurers could be forced to pay out. The entire conversation was apparently about money, and the officers didn't frame a single sentence around human lives. Some officers later claimed they were hesitant at first, but if that was the case, it didn't last. They eventually unanimously agreed that killing a large number of captives was the safer path for the voyage's financial outcome. By the time the meeting ended, the officers agreed to simply start throwing captives overboard. Later that evening, the crew began targeting the women and children. Officers believed the men would sell for more money once they reached Jamaica, so again, the finances dictated who lived. Starting around 8 o'clock that night, the crew forced 54 women and children through the cabin windows and into the sea. And this wouldn't be the end of it. 2 days later, this continued. This time, the officers ordered that the men be included in this round. Another 42 captives were brought up to the deck and thrown overboard. What made this second round even harder to justify was what was happening while it was going on. Rain fell heavily and replenished the ship's freshwater supply. The crew had even collected enough rainwater to significantly extend their drinking water, and the crisis they had feared had eased, yet for some reason the killings didn't stop. After the rain had refilled their supply, the crew still threw more into the ocean as 36 additional men were forced into the water over the next several days. Their deaths, like the others, were later cited by officers as part of the overall loss of cargo and were included in the coming insurance claim. In one case, a man who had been thrown overboard managed to climb back onto the ship, making it clear that many of those thrown overboard weren't sick or incapacitated. Not that it would have made any of this any better. By the time the Zong continued its course toward Jamaica, 142 people had been thrown overboard. And throughout the last two sequences of killings, the ship had plenty of water. This fact doesn't justify the first round, but it would go on to show that the decision wasn't fueled by any real threat to the ship's safety or to those aboard. The Zong finally reached Black River, Jamaica on December 22, 1781. After months at sea and weeks of turmoil, the ship carried only 208 surviving captives, which was less than half the number who boarded. The crew offered explanations for the drop in numbers and blamed it on sickness and a lack of supplies, even though the ship arrived with a significant amount of drinking water still on board. Then, 3 days after reaching Jamaica, Luke died from the illness. His death came before any official inquiry, and whatever he might have said about the voyage or the decisions made by his crew died with him. After the ship reached port, the surviving captives were sold in early January. Market prices at the time meant that each individual sold at an average price that would have been considered a successful profit. For the Liverpool merchants, the financial losses came from the people who never made it to market, and those are the ones they planned to claim through insurance. When the Zong's officers returned to Britain, that's exactly what the Liverpool group did. They argued that the killings were a necessary part of preserving the ship's cargo and that the insurers were obligated to compensate them for it, but the insurers rejected the request immediately. They didn't accept the explanation that they were unavoidable or that the ship had been in genuine danger. From their perspective, the officers had made a serious navigational mistake and mishandled the voyage before simply slaughtering many of the cargo for an easy payout. So in response, the Liverpool owners pushed the matter to court. The case got underway in London on March 6, 1783, and the presiding judge was Lord Mansfield, a well-known figure in British law. He had previously ruled on cases related to slavery, including a decision that suggested it had no basis in English law. Unfortunately, that earlier ruling didn't necessarily translate into broad protection for captives, though, and so it didn't play much of a role as the trial unfolded. The courtroom was instead entirely focused on the insurance dispute. The legal framework was much like that of the insurance industry of the time and viewed them as property, not people, so the trial followed along similar lines. Robert was the only witness called, and he described the voyage in a way that supported the owner's claims. And with no logbook, as the Zongs had mysteriously vanished, and no contradictory testimony, Robert's version of events went unchallenged. Under the insurance principles accepted at the time, a crew could get rid of cargo if doing so was necessary to save a ship. At the trial's conclusion, the jury ultimately agreed that the insurers were responsible for covering the loss. The case might have ended there, but something happened just days later that pushed the story into a wider public view. A former captive who had become a British abolitionist writer and speaker named Olaudah Equiano heard about the trial. He then immediately got in touch with his friend Granville Sharp, who was a leading activist in the anti-slavery movement. Granville had connections within the media and shared the story of the Zong with them. Newspapers then picked up the story and published lengthy accounts describing what had happened. For many readers, this was the first time they had heard of such violence carried out on captive ships by a British crew, and the idea that the ship's owners might profit from the killings only fueled greater outrage. And disturbed by both the killings and the treatment of the captives aboard the Zong, Granville sought advice about whether the crew could be prosecuted for murder. Unfortunately, while the idea of pursuing criminal charges didn't go far, Granville's efforts ensured that the case wouldn't just become a footnote in history. With public attention growing and the anti-slavery movement behind the cause, the insurers appealed the court's decision and requested a second trial. They insisted that they shouldn't have to pay for losses caused by the ship's own mistakes, and that stance was brought before the Court of King's Bench on May 21st and 22nd in 1783. This second hearing introduced new details about the voyage. Robert appeared again as a witness, and the court also reviewed a written statement from James. Both men repeated their story about the water shortages and the fear that everyone on board was in danger, but the insurers presented evidence that undermined that claim. One of the key facts that was brought to light in the appeal was the heavy rain that had fallen and how it was enough to refill several water casks. That meant the decision to continue throwing people overboard after the rainfall wasn't the result of any emergency. It instead pointed to a deliberate effort that would justify an insurance payout. The judges then seized on this point. If rain had replenished the water supply, then the crew couldn't argue that the killings were a necessity. One of the judges noted that the ship had sailed past Jamaica due to its own ignorance, and under insurance law, the fallout from such a mistake wasn't the insurer's responsibility. In other words, if the crew had created the crisis, they couldn't demand compensation for solving it. During the new hearing, all three judges acknowledged that the killing sounded like murder and questioned how anyone could justify throwing people into the sea, especially after drinking water had become available. So in the end, the judges overturned the first verdict and ruled that the insurers were not required to pay. This should have opened the door for a criminal trial, but this never happened. Neither the government nor private individuals succeeded in bringing murder charges against the crew. As public attention continued to grow throughout the appeal process, the Liverpool owners seemed to realize that pursuing the case any further would risk exposing even more details about what truly happened. With that, the legal proceedings simply stopped and the owners accepted the overturned verdict. They hoped that doing so would make it all go away, but it didn't. Public outrage wouldn't fade so easily, and Granville and other abolitionists recognized the Zong incident could serve as a turning point. He then began using the case in his larger efforts to challenge the legitimacy of the entire trade. He shared the story with religious groups and political allies, ensuring that anyone who might help push the topic into the national conversation was intimately aware of the Zong story. These groups then began drafting petitions and publishing accounts that exposed the conditions aboard captive ships. Their later release of the famous diagram of the captive ship, the Brook, in 1788 became one of the most influential images of the entire movement, and it can be traced back to the outrage sparked by the Zong. This public outrage didn't abolish the trade overnight, but it created an undeniable momentum that became harder for politicians to ignore. It may not have started the abolitionist movement, but the Zong pushed it forward at a crucial moment. In the decade that followed, pressure for reform continued to grow, and by 1788, Parliament passed its first attempt at regulating the conditions on British captive ships. This law limited how many captives a ship could carry to prevent overcrowding. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of a shift in how Britain viewed the entire trade. Then, finally, in 1807, Britain outlawed its participation in the trade entirely. Many factors contributed to that decision, but the Zong remained a reference point throughout the long campaign leading up to it. When Parliament finally abolished slavery across most of the British Empire in 1833, it came after decades of public debate in which the Zong played a central role. Despite these legal changes though, the Atlantic slave trade itself didn't just end. It continued for decades, especially through traders based in Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. As British and American naval patrols began intercepting captive ships, they uncovered more examples of violence at sea against captives. Captains would apparently routinely throw people overboard to avoid being caught with them on board. And even with increased enforcement, the illegal trade remained active well into the middle of the 19th century. Millions were transported across the Atlantic during these years, and countless deaths occurred along the way. It wouldn't be until 1865 that the United States abolished slavery with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And while the Zong incident wasn't necessarily a story that moved the needle toward that change, it did provide a spark in the abolitionist movement that eventually reached American shores. Today, the events in the Zong are remembered as a defining moment in the dark history of slavery because it exposed the trade's brutality to a wider audience that responded with calls for deep systemic change. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.